Chapter 11. Laughing Too Loud in Pompei. They landed in a quiet olive grove. The sun filtered gently through green-grey leaves, and there was a pleasant warm breeze. They got up slowly, dusting themselves off and adjusting their tunics. "How odd," Jane said. "We aren't in a village, and we're close by the sea. Look, you can see it twinkling through those trees." "I'm sure we're close enough." Peter pointed to the orchard to the bottom of the hill where a dirt road twisted. "Let's follow that." "Yes, all roads lead to Rome," Jane joked. "Are we going to Rome?" Maylee asked, frowning. "I thought we were going to Pompei." "Pompei. Yes, we are. It's just a saying that all roads lead to Rome. That came about because Rome used to be so important and powerful," Jane exclaimed. The children picked their way down the steep terraces of the olive grove until they reached the road. It led around the hill, and as they rounded the corner, they saw, about half a kilometre away, a high grey stone wall. Masses of closely packed roofs were visible above it, all covered in brightly coloured orange, red and brown terracotta tiles. Hearts beating fast, they walked cautiously along the road towards what looked like an official-looking gateway in the stone wall. As they got closer to the village, they started to hear a busy buzz, punctuated by barking, shouting, and funny intermittent rumbling noises. It sounded hectically busy. In front of them, also following the dusty path through the fields, was a long line of very slow-moving donkey carts, laden with goods that looked like vegetables or fruit. Another was filled with strange clay containers which looked like elongated jugs with round bottoms. "Those are amphora," Jane said knowledgeably. "I remember my aunt took lots of pictures of them. It was boring how many she had. I think they stored olive oil, grain, wine, all kinds of things in them." The children caught up with the carts when they halted, and they were reassured when their drivers glanced at them but didn't show any interest. Their disguises were working. Despite this comforting fact, they felt very nervous as they approached the entrance gates to Pompei. "Let's all keep hold of each other. Then if anything goes wrong, I can just wish us home," Sam said. He and Peter went first, discreetly holding onto each other's tunics, and the girls walked behind, holding hands, with Maylee clutching Peter's tunic from behind. It was quite tricky coordinating walking, and they weaved rather drunkenly towards the entrance. It was guarded by two men who held long, sharp spears. They were busy arguing in a strange language about something and shouting at a third man who appeared to be trying to leave. "That's Latin," Jane, the self-appointed language guru, said authoritatively, although this was actually a wild guess. As the children grew closer, one of the soldiers grabbed the man by the scruff of his neck and started shaking him. "Quickly," Peter said in rather a trembly voice. "Now!" And they scampered under the archway, past the distracted guards, and found themselves in the town. Someone yelled at them almost immediately, and they jumped hastily out of the road as a man on horseback came thundering past, exiting out the entrance. They stood on the narrow pavement, pressing their backs against a stone wall and surveying their surroundings with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. For a while they stood staring, too intimidated to move, but they began to attract the attention of a man selling what looked like small, round loaves of bread, and they ventured up the road. The town was a maze of narrow stone streets and tightly packed buildings, and they started to explore, sticking to small side streets, nervously wondering if they would be identified as the intruders they were. They felt reassured when the people who streamed past, women, men and children, paid them no particular attention. The citizens of Pompei seemed to be composed of a diverse mixture of people from different places and different walks of life. Some looked poor and were clad in simple dark-coloured clothes, while others swept by on horseback or in decorative horse-drawn carriages clad in bright, rich colours. It was as if they had walked onto a beautifully decorated movie set of a very different world to theirs. After walking for some time, Jane said, "This must be where the rich people live." "Yes, I bet those grand houses over there have sea views," Sam agreed. The house fronts they were passing were splendid, with marble pillars and mosaiced walkways, and through the odd opening they glimpsed courtyards with fountains and fruit trees, marble sculptures and brightly painted walls. Walls, floors, doors, everything was beautifully decorated and painted. "It's so fancy," Sam said, terribly impressed, and the others agreed. They had not been expecting such grandeur in ancient Rome. They walked all the way down one long road, then back up the next until they found themselves in a main road. They stood at the top and gazed down it, entranced but intimidated. There was an amazing array of transport, laden wheelbarrows pulled by sweating men stripped to the waist, assorted carts and covered wagons, and small one-seater horse-drawn carriages where the driver stood on a small platform. The passing vehicles had metal wheels and made an incredibly loud noise, frequently sending sparks flying. This, they realized, was the rumbling sound they'd heard when they were approaching the town. There was a strong smell in the air, a mixture of food, bread, and drains. They watched one of the small zippy carriages approaching at speed. It almost ran over a heavily built man carrying 2 large sacks, one on each shoulder. The man with the sack shouted after the driver, and although none of them spoke the lingo, his insight was clear. "Those are probably the equivalent of Porsches," Peter said, as they watched the small carriage and its standing driver veering around a corner out of sight. "You can really see that the Romans conquered far and wide," Sam said. "You can see there are people from all over the world here." "Yes," Peter agreed. "That's lucky for us because we fit in pretty easily. People dress so differently." "We don't look fashionable, though," Jane said, looking closely at the clothes of the young girl who was walking past, carrying a full sack on her head. At that moment, they heard a bell and turned to see an interesting procession heading towards them. 4 tall, muscular, black-skinned men were carrying a litter with drawn curtains. A man walked swiftly in front of them, ringing a warning bell and clearing a path for them through the crowds. They swept past the children and headed down the road. "What are those men carrying?" Maylee asked. "An important person, I guess," Sam said. It was Jane who made the ill-advised suggestion, "Let's follow them and see." The children had to jog to keep up with the fast pace and long legs of the litter bearers. They followed them down the road, passing marble water channels which fed clear water into large marble troughs set along the road and from which people were filling jugs and buckets. The litter they were following had eventually turned to the right, towards the sea, and they followed it into a huge open marble-floored space. It was an impressive sight. On one side was a huge marketplace, filled with tables and carts and people flogging their wares. Opposite this was a huge official-looking building with queues of people being directed by a man dressed in a very smart white and blue toga. It was decorated with brightly coloured statues inset into alcoves in the walls and had a high pointed roof, the eaves of which looked like they were made from gold. On the third side was a marble temple with rows of pillars painted red, yellow and dark blue, and walls with huge mosaics of what looked like gods sitting on clouds. "I never expected Pompei to be so smart," Jane said. "Yes, it's amazing. Everything is so fancy," Peter replied. The litter proceeded across the marble court and up the big temple steps to the top, where the bearers loaded slightly and stood waiting for its occupant to dismount. There was a pleasantly herby smell in the air. It seemed to be coming from the temple. The children sniffed appreciatively. It was much nicer than the drain smell of earlier. The children were halfway up the steps when the curtains parted and a small, round, very fat man maneuvered himself to the edge of the litter and then let himself drop the remaining inch to the ground. He must have leant too far forward and misjudged the distance, as he toppled slowly forwards and would have landed face first if the bell ringer had not shot out an arm and grabbed him, hauling him back onto his feet by his toga. It looked very comical, and all the children laughed, which would have been fine, as the older ones laughed quietly. But Maylee let out a terribly loud peal of laughter and cried excitedly, pointing, "Look! Did you see the fat one fall?" The fat man swung round at the sound of her laugh and saw the group of watching children below. He issued an instruction to his bearers, and 2 of them put down the litter and strode menacingly towards them. Sam's shout of "Run!" was unnecessary, as they were already all moving as fast as they could, leaping down the big marble steps. By instinct, they headed for the crowd in the marketplace, expecting their pursuers to give up, but they had likewise broken into a trot and started shouting something which made people in the crowd turn to stare at them, and some reached out and tried to grab the children as they sped past. It was both confusing and awful. Maylee, being small and the youngest, was particularly good at evading capture. She discovered that in games of catch-catch, If she kept running in a circle and turning sharply, the older children found it very hard to catch her. She darted here and there, throwing herself behind a cart piled high with fruit and vegetables when she thought she'd thrown off her pursuers. Fortunately for her, the owner of the cart was busy shouting out his wares and did not notice her. From her hiding spot, she saw Sam and Peter vanishing into the distance, followed by a bearer. They might have got away if the bearer hadn't shouted something to two men as the boys ran past them. The men wore sandals, tunics, and a thick leather belt from which hung leather thongs, a short sword, and a couple of knives. As Maylee watched, one of them grabbed Peter by the back of his neck, and in a few more paces, Sam was in the grips of the other. They held the struggling boys while they talked to the bearers, and then walked off, dragging the boys with them. Maylee started to cry. She was all alone, the others had disappeared, and she had no idea what to do. Her sniffs and sobs alerted the fruit seller, and he came around the back of the cart and peered under it. He said something to her, and she sobbed, "I don't understand. I can't speak Latin." He looked surprised at her speech, but unsurprised that she was foreign. He asked her a question, gesturing with his arms, but she couldn't understand. She tried to explain to him that she'd lost the others, but he misinterpreted her gestures and handed her a bunch of grapes, which she accepted politely. They tasted different to any she'd ever had, but were delicious, although some looked as if an insect had had a nibble. She decided to stay with the kind fruit seller until one of the others came and found her, remembering that her mother told her that if she got lost in a shopping centre, she should go to a policeman or shopkeeper and stay with them until she was found. "Stay close to where you got lost," her mother had instructed. The fruit seller seemed as good a place as any and seemed happy for her to sit under the cart. So she settled down with her bunch of grapes and prepared to wait it out. Please join us next week for Chapter 12, When in Rome, Do as the Romans Do.